there's nothing Mercedes can do that is as demotivating for a driver as what happened to Lewis Hamilton in Abu Dhabi 2021. Bro, if you're not going to retire after someone did that to you, what happened in Abu Dhabi, Mercedes being slow is not going to cause you to retire. Could you imagine how horrific and terrible it would be if, worst case scenario, Mercedes is unable to deliver a competitive race car for the foreseeable future, and the last opportunity that Lewis Hamilton, the great Sir Lewis Hamilton, has had to compete for a historic championship that he earned was taken away from him unjustly? I mean, that's crazy talk. That's what I love about engineering. You know, it seems we're always in this feeling that it's a big change that's going to make your car better. Change the side pods, change the front wing end plate, change all this, change that. And the thing is, it is a sum total of thousands upon thousands of small changes, small details kind of working together that actually gives you the result in performance. Aston Martin has the same power unit. They have the same rear end, rear suspension and gearbox. They use even the same wind tunnel as Mercedes does.
I'm done. When I heard that, Bryson, I nearly lost my SH1T. The same wind tunnel. What are we doing, Bryson? This is bonkers, mate. Bonkers. Customer car, quicker, of course.
I don't want people calling for someone's head at Mercedes to really be taken seriously. I want to impress upon people, this is complicated. It's extremely complicated. And sometimes you can be led in the wrong direction because it looks very much like the right direction.
Mr. Sullivan, how are you doing, sir? It's a pleasure to have you back on the channel. The F1 Hour, the inaugural F1 Hour guest, by the way. How are you keeping, bruv?
I'm good. It was a long winter break. I'm glad we're back racing again. We had a few interesting developments over winter testing and the Bahrain GP, but overall, I'm just glad for the season start again.
Oh, just a few. Just a couple of things for us to address on this episode, Bryson. So we talk, first port of call, shall we talk to the Bahrain Grand Prix and the dominance, ostensibly, that Red Bull imposed on the rest of the field? Give me some context, Bryson. What are we seeing here? Why are Red Bull and the RB19 anywhere between a second and a half over the field in terms of their favourable variance time-wise?
Yeah, it's not really clear how far ahead of the field they really are because they were managing their pace at the end. Right. If we listen to what Max was saying and what others were saying, and you listen to the radios, GP was chiding Max for pushing too hard on the final two stints and he wasn't doing the target lap time. So we don't actually know how much extra pace they have in hand. I definitely think that a part of this is due to the specifics of the track configuration. Bahrain is a very rear limited circuit that requires much more balance on the front end. Like an understeers have proper balance in order to protect their rears. But at the same time, we knew from testing that Red Bull was in a very comfortable place. Now, to be clear, there were some changes between what testing was going on and during the race itself. Part of those are due to environmental factors between testing and FP1. A bit of sand in certain places, a bit more rubber, things like this. But also there may have been some modifications that Red Bull has had to make to their floor in order to make sure that it wasn't actually wearing out the plank underneath. But Red Bull has a ton of pace. They have a lot of downforce. They still have kept that very, very competitive high-end speed. And the deg is just excellent, the tire degradation. I think only Aston Martin really was competing with them in terms of tire degradation, and Aston didn't have the same pace that they had. So they definitely made a big step in the right direction. And obviously we'll talk about some of the other teams in the future, but essentially the gap that we see right now is not only a reflection of other teams not really performing to the degree that they were hoping to, but Red Bull just taking a big step, not just with Max either, with Checo as well. He was a little bit over a tenth behind in qualifying, and he was right there in the race. So definitely a step in the right direction. As far as what they did, we know that there's an evolution of the side pod design. We know that there were some other changes to aero things, but I think one of the biggest things is something we can't see with our eyes, and that is weight reduction. People don't realize that the RB18 was overweight for almost all of the season, and they weren't actually able to bring that lightweight chassis to the season last time because of the cost cap considerations. And so now we're seeing that too. And what I kind of want to emphasize from a technical perspective is not only does reducing the weight help in general when you get to the weight limit, but if you go under the weight limit, by a significant amount, and you ballast up the car to get to the weight limit,
Oh,
you can put that weight wherever you want. You can put it really low on the car. You can put it really far forward, maybe even in the front wing.
what
It,
are
it
we
can
doing,
really
Bryson?
improve the match properties of the car and the handling a lot, and that just gives the driver confidence.
Bryson, so the upshot of what you're saying is that Red Bull are anywhere between a second and a second and a half over the field potentially.
Like I said,
If
it
if
depends. It
everything's
depends on
turned
the
up to
circuit.
12.
Yeah, it depends on the circuit. I mean, like I said before, Bahrain is a very rear limited circuit. A lot of big stops, but like big traction zones on the exits. I'm very curious to see how things shake out in Jeddah. It's a very different type of layout for a circuit configuration. I think Ferrari is going to be much more competitive there, not only because it's the surface in Jeddah, is it going to chew through tires in the same
Mm,
way, just the
mm.
actual, surface itself. But there's far fewer traction zones, a lot more sort of high speed corners. Um, Ferrari did sacrifice a bit of their ultimate downforce for top speed this season, it would appear, but I still think they're going to be more competitive in Jeddah than they were in Bahrain.
Here's hoping, Bryson, as a fan of competitive wheel to wheel racing, hoping for that for 23 races this season. Ferrari need to absolutely step up. I just want to take a step back a second to cover this Red Bull thing because I watched Max in qualifying and his lap just seemed very easy. He seems like the Rolls Royce driver that's not fussed, nonplussed, completely at ease, completely in flow state, driving Miss Daisy settings. Bryson, I am super concerned, right? I hear to your point about the variability in tracks, and Jeddah is a completely different ball game as far as its dynamic and its challenges that it poses to each of these cars. But Bryson, that being said, everything that I'm hearing is that was we haven't even scraped the barrel as far as the overall dominance. To your points, and I'm going to summarise them for guys that are listening. They've erred on the side of caution as far as the ride height or the floor of the car, even to be precise, because again, they said they thought that the skid block underneath might wear potentially and get them disqualified or at least a very big penalty. So they've erred on the side of caution and raised that car higher. So it's not even where it was in testing. That's your first piece. They turned down all of the engines. They were managing, like you said, Bryson, they're at this stage of dominance already in race one where they're managing reliability and turning down engines in real time in the race. What do we do? And then Bryson, what concerned me even more, we know that Red Bull, as far as doing their due diligence in free practice, are just unbelievable. They were the only team to do long runs, long simulation runs on each of the compounds in free practice. Due diligence, crazy, right? But then in qualifying, again, it looks like we've drafted in a car from a higher formula. The way they're operating, they're not kind of they've just got time and resource and everything in hand, and it's upsetting, Bryson. Like I don't know, maybe I'm drinking the Red Bull Kool-Aid here, but I just see even when do you remember Q3? So I'm watching Q3 live and I'm thinking, listen, somebody's got to go out there and challenge. And plus in Q2, I got a bit happy because it looked like, if you remember, like the Mercedes guys were very close to Max. I was like, I'm going to have to eat umbo pie here. Mercedes have done it. We have a car. Then Q3 happens. And because they've saved so many soft compound tyres from Q1, because they only did one lap pretty much, and then they rested for the most part in Q2, weren't even out in the latter stages of Q2. We find ourselves in a situation, Bryson, which epitomises dominance for me, in that the last ones on the track in Q3, you've got Checo and you've got Max just dawdling around, almost just doing time trials as if it was Gran Turismo. And the only guys out there on the track challenging them is Stroll, and I want to say there's one other one. No one else. Leclerc sacked it off. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
this is
the
bonkers,
qualifying
Bryson.
the qualifying was interesting because there were definitely some strategic plays going on there. So both Alonso and Mercedes and Leclerc really did one run in the middle of that Q3 as opposed to two separate runs. And that was a strategic play to give them a better shot for the race. So I suspect that the actual gaps in qualifying, if they had done like for like tire compounds and everything else, would probably be closer than it was. But there's no question that Red Bull is in a supreme position right now. As I said before, we need to see a few more tracks to know how translatable that is to all the circuits. But there's no question that they're going to be there. And as I said before, obviously the big talking point of the weekend was that Mercedes was becoming clear
Oh,
that they need to change their concept, which is kind of a nebulous word itself. But we'll get there. One of the biggest, the measuring stick for determining what they have to do is ultimately Red Bull. Yes, it's true that Aston Martin usurped their position, or even Ferrari's position to a degree this season. But in terms of the actual gap to Red Bull itself, it's bigger than it was last year for W14. And that's not to say that W14 isn't faster than the W13. It is. All the cars are faster. It's just Mercedes didn't gain enough time compared to their rivals.
and why then, Bryson, is that? Let's get into the W14 madness. I'm sick and tired of talking about Red Bull and their durable competitive advantage, which again I don't think we know the depths of just yet, and that concerns me. But let's talk about Mercedes because this is what the community want to talk about, right? I've been saying for the longest time that I was concerned about the side pods, and I was reassured by Mercedes fans in the community that side pods weren't the root cause of Mercedes' perceived lack of pace, because it did improve over time last season. We did see notable material improvements. Take that tick. Bryson, what's the fundamental, what's the root cause? And it sounds like this is a Rubik's Cube problem that Mercedes need to solve. But what, in your opinion, are the, like, say, two or three candidates most likely? These are the two or three aerodynamic or mechanical things that they need to absolutely nail to get this car back where it needs to be.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story because every layer that they peeled away that seemed to be the most pressing problem with the W13, they seemed to find another one when they peeled that first layer back. Initially, it was the aggressive and kind of outrageous porpoising, which required them to change the ride height. They dialed that in, I would say, pretty well by Barcelona last season.
Yeah.
And then they discovered this bottoming issue, which is kind of a separate issue due to the ride quality. And I remember actually going back to something we said on the podcast when we talked about what the Mercedes was saying about why they were losing so much time. They said, "Hey, our car is 1.5 seconds faster than the entire grid. It's just this porpoising issue that was giving us problems." And then they solved the porpoising issue, and then there was other things as well. And I remember saying,
I remember,
it,
Bryson.
"You remember,
I'll
don't you?"
regret, of course, you said if you solve the porpoising issue and it's
And it's
still
not.
not fast, bin the concept. Bin the
Yeah, and
concept.
and just to be clear, we use this word concept quite frequently, almost interchangeably with side pods, and that's probably not really fair.
Hmm,
There are other things that go into a concept like the floor design, how the front wing
of
interacts
course.
with the front of the floor, and the management of the front tire wake, and all of these things. I think it might be more instructive to call it a philosophy of the car rather than a concept. The
Love that.
philosophy of the car is what really needs to change. I think that kind of emphasizes the difference between pure side pod design and then the entire thing working together. Right? So to answer your question about what Mercedes needs and what the W14 is lacking, it's actually much better now in terms of straight line speed than it was before. They've cut their drag problem to manageable levels. They're not quite as fast as Ferrari now. They're not quite as fast as Red Bull, an absolute qualifying pace,
Hmm.
pure drag. But they definitely have less of that than the W13 had. The issue is they just lack downforce. They're lacking a ton of downforce, and it's not just that they are missing their targets necessarily, because there seems to be some indication that they had targets set and they seem to have meet them in this concept. But when they're being presented with, unambiguous evidence of what other people are getting, the kind of downforce levels they're getting, those targets really weren't ambitious enough. And there's not enough downforce on the front axle or the rear axle. Not only does that affect your ultimate lap time, which is what most people think about, but it affects tire degradation, like aggressively. One of the reasons we believe that Ferrari is so uh, alarming in terms of their tire degradation is because they've taken off a ton of downforce. Ferrari's taken off a tremendous amount of downforce. They've gained top speed as a
Mm.
result of that, but they've lost that, and so that causes problems with tire deg. I have to say, I think as far as Mercedes goes, how we got to this point is actually quite interesting, and I believe it actually started in a few years ago with the W09, really,
Oh,
several years ago. And Mercedes during that time and building up to 2020 and even 2021 went down this path of making smaller and smaller and smaller side pods, like smaller every year seemed to get tighter and better packaged. I think all the teams really were doing that to an extent, but Mercedes were kings of it. And people were wondering, well, why would you want smaller side pods to begin with? And the thing of it is, you want to minimize the amount of disruption to the back of the floor. You want to maximize the amount of clean airflow. And you don't actually have to worry so much about the front tire wake sort of creeping into unwelcome areas with the previous generation cars, because we have these beautiful aerodynamically loaded surfaces, these barge boards, and ton of outwash, blown axles to the front wheels, all kinds of stuff that could prevent that front tire wake from ever getting into the problematic areas, even in cornering, not just in a straight line, but in cornering as well. And I think Mercedes was kind of thinking that that was going to be a similar thing, in the upcoming seasons or in the upcoming generation in 2022. What I think is actually driving all of this is that smaller side pods can't give you the same benefit overall that in this current generation that they gave previously, precisely because we don't have barge boards anymore. Right? There's so much that you could get away with where the most ideal thing is you want to make a small side pod. Why would it be good? Is you can make the side pod so small that no part of the front tire wake touches any part of the car and gets dragged into the problematic area.
mm.
You can do that with barge boards, but when we suddenly don't have barge boards anymore, if you try to do that, even if in a straight line the tire wake goes exactly where you want to, no problem whatsoever. What happens in cornering? What's going on then? And often, if you look at the kinematics of this, it's not the inside wheel tire wake that's the problem when you're turning, because that actually gets dragged further away from the body of the car. It's actually the outside one when you're
Oh,
turning, and it's the one that's sort of going towards that bottom, the back outside corner of the car. That's where you could really get a problem. And so I think here's the way I would say this, and you mentioned this before. Mercedes has said oftentimes the side pod is not the core of our concept. This means a lot of things. All you see is the side pod. You don't see all the other aspects of it, and that of the concept rather, and you don't see all the other parts of it. That's true, but let's just take a step back and look empirically at what the grid has done. Right, what the grid has done. 3, 4 teams have made drastic changes to their side pod or over the course of the season, and the argument has to be, well, they may have chosen to do that, but that's not the main performance differentiator in their concept. And it's like, well, at some point you have to start looking at it. I mean, at some point you have to look at it. And even when you look at the evolution of the launch spec W14 compared to the W13, it has different side pods than the W13 had. They're wider already. They're already getting wider towards the back end, and the inlet's a little bit different. So there are things in the pipework that are coming. We can have a little bit more detailed discussion about that, but Mercedes fundamentally is in a development path that's not yielding the kind of performance that they need, or at a minimum, it's not yielding it as quickly as they need it to be competitive compared to their rivals. And they're at a point now where they're saying, yes, okay, we need to look at something else.
and
And
it's about
and
bloody time, mate.
and,
You know
and
what I mean?
again, yes, it's going to include side pod changes. That's going to include floor changes. It's going to include a lot of things. We know there's something coming for Imola, for the car. It was talked about preseason by Mike Elliott. They may even bring that forward now, given the severity of the situation that they find themselves in. I expect that to have larger side pods, but even that in itself is not the radical change in direction that I think has been talked about since the Bahrain GP. I think that was a real wake up call, if not for Red Bull, especially for Aston Martin. Okay, because Aston Martin has the same power unit, they have the same rear end, rear suspension and gearbox. They use even the same wind tunnel as
Mate,
Mercedes does.
I'm
So
done. That when I heard that, Bryson, I nearly lost my SH1T. The same wind tunnel. What are we doing, Bryson? This is bonkers, mate.
I mean,
Bonkers. Customer
look,
car. quicker, of course.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we can't deny the importance of personnel going from Mercedes,
You're
to Aston Martin. Not only do they bring their expertise and ability to attack problems, but they know things. Like people know things that sometimes it literally is as simple as moving someone from point
right.
A to point B, transfer something, and the bottom line is they've done a better job with the same hardware than Mercedes has done. And even though, as you said, Red Bull is the ultimate bar by which they have to measure themselves if they want to compete for championships, Aston Martin being ahead of them, even in one race on merit, is not going to go down well in the board meetings at Stuttgart, right? I mean, you can't countenance that. Something has to change. And I think the positive for Mercedes fans is that they are admitting to this. They're saying, listen, we could push this down further. And in fact, they will continue to develop the W14 in its current form as the season goes on. And I suspect they'll win a few races this season. But what they're really talking about in terms of concept change is really about 2024, 2025, and especially in the years after that, because they're just trying to give themselves a fighting chance. And I think they're on the right path to do that.
Why then, Bryson? As a follow-up question. So there are green shoots in there. I hear you, but why, as a god tier level aerodynamicist?
Don't do that. Don't.
Just
I study this stuff and I love it, but as much more about it that I know than you, there are people that know as much more about it than I do. So
okay. All right.
I'm just a communicator.
Behave yourself. Go on then, Bryson. So how do we get here? Because I'm hearing that there's nothing. Porpoising was a anomaly last year in that it was a massive. The data didn't correlate with what we saw in real life because primarily of porpoising. I'm hearing that isn't the case this year. That there is like as near as makes no difference, 100% correlation between the data that they're seeing in the CFD in the wind tunnel and what they're seeing in real life. So Bryson, I pose the question back to you then. How do we get here as Mercedes? How does that process work to where they looked and thought, okay, let's go down. Let's just remix W13 as W14, and hopefully we can get Sir Lewis the 8th/9th, depending on who you talk to, that way. How do you get there, Bryson?
I think the short answer and the answer no one wants to hear is that aerodynamics is complicated. It's extremely complicated, and,
Right.
and people have this idea that the design that a team comes up with is a pure, you know, focused and like stepped process that leads to A, B,
Mm,
C, boom, optimal aerodynamic design. Whereas the design of these cars is just as much a manifestation of the personalities and the background, the technical backgrounds of the people who are building the cars, as much as it is the science itself. And I spoke to Stuart Mitchell about this from Race Car Engineering on the Tech Heads F1 podcast, cheeky plug. But we talked about this, and he says even just looking at a car, looking at who the team principal is, who the key personnel is, what their background is, you can get a flavor for how they might try to design a car. For example, Mike Elliott, who is a technical director of Mercedes F1, excellent aerodynamicist. I mean, his background is in aerodynamics. He was doing that for almost his entire career, and you can tell that someone at the team, maybe Mike, maybe someone else, could tell they figured out something clever, very clever, at the beginning of 2022. We know that because they went through the process and the effort of hiding it, of actively hiding it from the competition with a faux side pod design for the first test, right? They thought they had really the bee's knees, this is the optimal design. And the reality of the situation is we know far less about reality than we think we know. And the problem is because sometimes there's correlation between how we expect things to work and then how they actually work, we're falsely deceived into believing we're causally linking these things. Like this is the reason why this is good is because of A, is because of B, is because of C. We often hear this in terms of very successful race teams or very successful dynasties. They say, yes, we studied how other dynasties worked and how they failed and what caused them to be knocked off of their pedestal, but we understand it. We know now exactly how this happened. Our culture is understands the critical factors to be able to avoid that. and then external factors come in that perturb the system in an unexpected and different way, and suddenly you can't get back to the level that you were at before, even though you have this knowledge. And so it's very complicated, and I don't want people calling for someone's head at Mercedes to really be taken seriously. I want to impress upon people this is complicated. It's extremely complicated, and sometimes you can be led in the wrong direction because it looks very much like the right direction. I think the old saying is the stopwatch never lies, right? I mean, that's the ultimate that's the ultimate feedback is that no matter how favorable our perception is that we're going the right direction. And even then, it wasn't necessarily true because they were experimenting with other side pod designs, the wind tunnel and safety already before this race. But it just becomes clear that sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you learn something new as the passage of time goes on, and then you change your thinking. Just a small point to emphasize this upgrade package coming in Imola, I believe, wasn't like a normal plan. We believe that this is a consequence of all the problems in the W13 in 2022 delaying their development work for so long that they were finding lap time, finding new areas to of the design space to explore as time went on. And there actually may have been a very late discovery in the process of building W14 where they decided, oh, there's actually a lot more performance on the table here, but it's just not going to be ready for race one. And so they were preparing that. And so I do view the car that we will see in Imola as an evolution of the design direction that they were going in previously. Granted, there may be some feedback given, how Bahrain went, but this radical concept shift that Toto was talking about and others are talking about is really not even about 2023. It's about giving Mercedes a fighting chance for 2024, 2025, etc. As I said, I think they're still going to win some races, but that's not good enough for them. Their ambitions are to compete for championships. And to do that, they have to make fundamental changes.
Oh, Bryson, I told you he was the GOAT at the outset. I did tell you. And there it is, manifest live in living colour. The side pods, we talked about front wake. I think you talked about kinematics. Talk to me like I'm an idiot around the side pod front wake without using aerodynamic terms. What is it about the barge board, the combination of the barge board, the floor height that makes not having a slim side pod possible, as far as controlling the wake outboard?
Yeah, I mean it's the
hard,
front
isn't it?
it's the front tires is the problem. These are these massive rotating spinning things that create this incredibly dirty airflow behind them. And depending on what happens in the bodywork behind, it's either totally unconstrained or directed to get as far away from your own car as possible, right? This is the defining characteristic of open wheel race cars. But what's interesting is that in the previous generation of cars, we had proper barge boards, not just a surface that directly moved air outboard, but this is a little bit of an aero thing, but it had a suction surface and a pressure surface, which is what a wing has, versus a spoiler just has like a pressure surface. It's just like a high pressure, it just turns the air. It's really the back side of that surface does a lot of the heavy lifting as far as accelerating the flow goes, just like a main wing. If you look at a rear wing or a front wing and the total pressure differential across it that results in downforce, it's the suction on the underside that's really giving you the majority of the force. But we don't have barge boards in 2022 and beyond, primarily by design, because the FAA is trying to prevent the teams from thrusting all that flow outboard. It helps their own car, but makes it harder to follow, et cetera, et cetera. So now that we have that flow, that wake coming off of the front tire, far less constrained, suddenly you need something else in play to prevent that wake from going to the back end of the Coke bottle of the car, leaking under the side of the floor or going to the top of the diffuser in the beam wing. It's just robbing you of downforce. And the thing is, a very tiny side pod, while it does in principle draw clean air from the outside, more towards the back end, that front tire wake is still there. It's still there. It also can be drawn in as well. And as I said before, it's not just a straight line performance that really matters because these cars are dynamic, moving, shifting machines that are constantly in different states of roll and pitch, and there's wind conditions. What I am to encapsulate this in the simplest way possible. Imagine performance as a function of some variable, ride height, whatever, and higher is better. Okay. The W13 and the zero pod concept and the entire philosophy of the way that they're designing the car has a very peaky aero map, which is to say, it's really, really high performance in a very, very narrow window, right? A less peaky aero map would be something that was much broader in its base. Maybe it doesn't achieve the same theoretical maximums, but the realizable gains are much more. And it just seemed like the W13 and to extent the W14 as well was just on a knife edge. It's not an absolute knife edge regarding the setup window. This is kind of evidenced by what you were saying previously about Mercedes suddenly showing up on Saturday for qualifying. They looked in shambles on Friday, partially because of the miracles that the engineers worked behind the scenes. But this is evidence of a setup window issue on top of the overall downforce question. And the thing is, engineers can't be expected to work miracles indefinitely. At some point, there is actually something fundamental about the car that needs to change. But from an aeros perspective, that front tire wake is one of the things that is most important. We can also talk a little bit about the wake coming off of the cockpit and the halo. That's something that's also low energy, just like the wheel is, although it might not be as big or as turbulent. It's it's really given as the primary motivation for these hulking shoulders that we're seeing on the Mercedes, the sort of gullies that Michael called it, the direct flow towards the rear wing. It's just trying to channel that and put it in a very direct place where it actually can not influence other things.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be beneficial for drag reduction, but that in itself isn't going to necessarily improve the downforce. And it seems not to have. Again, I don't want to oversimplify these things because I don't have access to all the information that they have. I don't have their CFD. I don't have their wind tunnel information. There's a lot more going on than we can see from the outside, but the net result of which is they just aren't producing the downforce that they need. As far as managing that front tire wake, a way to survey this is look at other cars in the grid. You look at Aston Martin, you look at Ferrari and Red Bull, and you're trying to do kind of two things simultaneously. You want to keep that front tire wake away from the car as much as possible, but there also are clean sources of air not far, above it or beside it or somewhere else that you do want to go to the back of the diffuser, that you do want to hit parts of the back of the car. And so you have to sort of navigate this weird space where there's a trajectory, a stream tube of air you are desperately trying to avoid that is very closely intermingled with air you're trying to use. And so how do you split it? Do you try to drag more air from the top? And this is what one of the things that the downwashing part of the back end of the side pod does very well. It gives flow from the top of the car above the side pod, a nice clean trajectory to get right to the back of the floor and in the diffuser. It's what the undercut also does very well. That deeper channel underneath the side pod also does very well on the RB19. There is some air there that can be drawn directly underneath the car. It requires a very complicated shape. We saw Aston Martin experiment with this early on, didn't quite work. But there are shapes that you can actually use. And then you simultaneously need some side pod that's further outboard to keep that wake to the side. So it's hugely complicated. It's hugely nonlinear. But whatever Mercedes is doing, they're in a part of the design space where there's a ceiling to how much they can develop this. They need to try some different directions to really make progress.
Holy smokes, Bryson. And finally on this, mate, explain to me in idiot terms what because they clearly, to your point earlier, right, they're not dummies at Mercedes, even though some of us, myself included, feel like they are because of how long they've taken to come to this conclusion that this isn't the design philosophy, to your point, that we want to be pursuing. What's the upside, Bryson, from having a very slim side pod?
Yeah, as I was saying, I mean, very, very slim in principle, if the flow is going exactly the way that you want it to go, can draw a lot of clean air to the floor and to the back of the car. That's definitely a thing. There's no question that can happen. As I said before, it was the philosophy that all the cars are trying to do more and more and more in the previous generation of F1, right? We had barge boards that would help take care of the front tire wake. So you could actually slim the side pod down as much as you want to. And the only thing you're dragging in is clean air. The problem is, this is my suspicion. The problem is now that we don't have those barge boards, we don't have the blown axles anymore. There's so much outwash at the front of the car. Not only are you drawing clean air in now, you're also drawing in that the front tire wake. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. There are also some modifications to the diffuser and the beaming that I think other teams have explored that I think Mercedes to try to explore. Specifically, what I mean is that there's a box that the FIA defines in which your diffuser volume can sit. And pretty much every team, except for Red Bull and maybe Aston Martin to a degree, has used every millimeter of that space for volume in the diffuser. Because in general, the bigger that volume is, the more acceleration you can get of the flow underneath the car. Great. The thing is, Red Bull doesn't do that. Red Bull doesn't actually use the entire volume. Not only do they have much more rounded corners to the diffuser from the roof to the sides of it, but the roof of the diffuser is slightly below where the FIA box would allow it to be. And then they use that extra real estate to have like a curl, a flip up at the trailing edge of the diffuser that actually looks a lot like a gurney flap to me, like a large radius gurney flap. And I think that's actually one of the bigger things that's actually helping them get so much performance is that they're getting more volumetric expansion out of the flow than you might otherwise expect by just making the shape bigger. So I think this is in the category of aero development and things they've done to improve their car. That's what I love about engineering. It seems we're always in this feeling that it's a big change that's going to make your car better. Change the side pods, change the front wing end plate, change all this, change that. And the thing is, it is a sum total of thousands upon thousands of small changes, small details kind of working together that actually gives you the net result in the performance. The average person, and even the trained person, can't tell the difference between 5 degrees and 3.5 degrees for an angle for a surface. But I can tell you from an aero side, it makes all the difference in the world, especially in something as complicated as a Formula One car. The final thing that I would say about Red Bull and their progress that they've made is that there's going to be a lot of talk about cost cap violations and the penalties that they are experiencing, and people being dissatisfied with Red Bull not being slowed down enough, seemingly, by that cost cap violation. And my recommendation or my response to that is the car that we see today, racing for Red Bull, was largely created, 6 months ago, 7 months ago. The development process of that began a long time ago. They're actually the power of that package was baked into the design much earlier on. If the cost cap violation and the sliding scale for safety and wind tunnel time, because they were first in the constructors last year, if those things are actually going to have an impact on Red Bull, it's going to show up later in the season, middle of the season, second half of the season, where they actually are engaged in a development war with other teams to try to keep their car competitive. Because as we said, standing still in Formula One is going backwards, right? It's always been the case. So if we're concerned about the cost cap penalty not being as effective as many would like it to be, just wait a bit until the second part of the season. I think things will be a lot tighter.
If we even get there, Mr. Sullivan, at the moment they look unstoppable to the point where they could down tools and start developing the 24 car and not really have much bother even as at race 23.
I just don't do that because how many teams in the history of Formula One, 50 years, 60 years, whatever, half a century, how many teams have actually won every single race in the season?
That's never happened. That's never happened. There's been some very dominant.
McLaren came very, very close in the MP44 era.
That was ridiculous. I want to say Mansell in 92, 93, maybe.
They came very close. I promise you, no matter how good you think you are or how good you actually are, how good your car is, factors will conspire against you. It will prevent you from winning every race. And you know what? It's actually harder now than it was in the 80s.
True.
Because we have more races per season now than we had before. So it's more opportunities for something to go wrong, more opportunities for reliability issues or a collision, or you set the car up wrong. And as I said before, this actually kind of gets to why Mercedes was so committed to the zero pod concept, based on their performance last year. They were actually scoring podiums pretty regularly, and they won a race in Brazil, which was one of those things that was thought to be really the defining moment when we said, okay, we can still get together this car because we want to race. That's what we want to see.
Flattered to deceive,
and the more we look at this, and I was listening to a friend of the podcast, Peter Windsor, recently talking about the ride height compromises that Red Bull had to make for that Brazil weekend last year, specifically because it was a sprint race. And the height that they actually chose, they were locked in to choose because of what was going on with the sprint. And it was just wrong. It was just totally wrong for both cars. And so, yes, the W13 did win a race, and yes, it was the fastest car that weekend, but it was just as much due to Mercedes' own performance as it was Red Bull faltering, it would seem. And I think the ultimate evidence of that is Bahrain this season. There's just so much more pace that was needed in the car that's just not there.
Oh, Bryson. Feel like a wake, no pun intended, every time. Not wake as in dirty air, wake as in funeral for all Mercedes fans. It's not a good look. Bryson, talk to me about. Sorry, mate. Go on. You were going to say.
I was just gonna say, if people are in a bad mood about this, I would just say I wouldn't really be. I think it was kind of a wake up call to Mercedes for a customer team to perform as well as Aston Martin has with the same engine and a lot of the same components. It really is the only thing that was needed to really make a fundamental shift. And again, if you really want Mercedes to win, it shouldn't matter how they go about doing it legally, and it shouldn't matter what they have to do in order to do it, even if it means backtracking. So I'm excited about this. This is the beginning of a new chapter of Mercedes. I'm looking forward to it.
Let's go, Bryson. This is a problem right up your street. But again, I don't understand enough. And I see my driver struggling and losing. Talk to me about how you think Lewis Hamilton must be feeling, because I feel like Lewis has been patient a la a patron saint, because he wants to get back right. He's been dying on the back of Abu Dhabi 21 to get in a car that's quick enough for him to race with Max Verstappen. Even discount Abu Dhabi, Lewis is a racer at core, fundamental constitution. That's all that Lewis has done all his life. He wants to race. And if you don't give him a car that's quick enough to race for the podium positions, how, Bryson, if you put your Lewis Hamilton cap on, how's he going to be feeling at the moment with retirement being talked about, and again Abu Dhabi still fresh in the mind? How's Lewis going to be dealing with this season if we see stasis as far as the delta between Mercedes and Red Bull for 23 races?
I think there's a lot of this talk about retirement and all the issues that Mercedes is having, but I think a lot of that is projection, especially from pundits and former drivers. They ask themselves, what would they do in the situation? What would they do if they had their incredible skill and motivation to secure a historic title, and their team was failing you? Ultimately, would you just call it a day? And this is kind of a weird way to think about this. I would argue there's nothing Mercedes can do that is as demotivating for a driver as what happened to Lewis Hamilton in Abu Dhabi 2021. Bro, if you're not going to retire after someone did that to you, what happened in Abu Dhabi, Mercedes being slow is not going to cause you to retire. Not only that, but Mercedes is Lewis's home that he's built. He's committed to seeing the team improve. And let's also not forget, Lewis is racing not only to, he really has never raced to have accolades and have the most championships, or whatever. He just loves racing. And that's a bigger factor than people are accounting for when we talk about why he's continuing to race. There's no better person, excuse me, there's no better person I'd rather have in the car for me driving than Lewis Hamilton if I knew I was in the mud and needed to develop a car and needed quality, solid feedback. He's exactly the person I would want to have in the car to be able to get it to where it needs to be. Like, granted, he shouldn't really have to do that, right? But again, I said before, Formula One's complicated. There are ways in which people can be knocked off their perch. Think about Red Bull. Think about their air dominance in 2010 to 2013. They had Adrian Newey building these fantastic cars. I can assure you, Adrian Newey didn't forget how to build race cars after 2013. Okay. He was just as brilliant then. He knew exactly what to do, but it's complicated and it takes time to be able to figure out a way to get back to the front. A brief note on Abu Dhabi, though. I've said this before, but it's worth reemphasizing. There's no future success that Lewis Hamilton can have or that Mercedes can have that will make what happened in Abu Dhabi right. That was wrong fundamentally, and there's no oh, now you've got a chance to go for your eighth now. Now you can actually do it. Is this your chance? No, I mean, that was a grievous injury that was ultimately unjust. You can talk about the specifics of how it happened and what happened afterwards. But fundamentally, I view that as wrongdoing that's just been accepted in the community. And it is a shame because it shows how rare it is, how unique it is for someone to be talented enough and motivated enough and given the equipment to be able to actually compete for a championship. That's not as common as people think. I mean, could you imagine how horrific and terrible it would be if, worst case scenario, Mercedes is unable to deliver a competitive race car for the foreseeable future, and the last opportunity that Lewis Hamilton, the great Sir Lewis Hamilton, has had to compete for a historic championship that he earned was taken away from him unjustly? I mean, that's crazy talk. I mean, that is, regardless of how great people think Max Verstappen is and how great he really is. I mean, he's proven over time he's been a great driver. He did not win the 2021 championship fairly, and nothing that happens in the future will change that fact. So I think we should just be cognizant of the circumstances that are happening, be aware of the work that Mercedes has ahead of them, but they're committed to the project. I think it's only a positive sign that they're admitting right away that if they want to have any shot at actually giving Lewis a competitive car in the next 2 years, they just have to reverse course and take a new direction.
Oh, Bryson, that silly liquid there that you just talked about, potentially Abu Dhabi being the last opportunity for Lewis to have in his career to win a championship. That's been a feeling that's plagued me ever since Abu Dhabi. Because sport sometimes is like this, right, Bryson? We've seen it in F1 a million and one times. Who knew that 2004 would be Schumacher's last championship? I didn't. I didn't think I'd ever at the time see anybody come along and beat Schumacher before he retired in that Ferrari with Jean Todt and Ross Brawn.
Mm-hmm.
And then who knew that Alonso was going to come in that very dodgy Renault and come and nail it?
It was beautiful. The Reynolds of the old days, Mild 7 were beautiful cars.
Oh my gosh.
But no, I think in the immediate aftermath of Abu Dhabi, I think Samuel Jackson said it best. And he said that tomorrow is not guaranteed. You know, if something is wrong, you should really be fighting for it. You shouldn't assume that you can do it again in the future. So, as I said, the 99% of all decisions ever related to Abu Dhabi are made, and we will talk about that probably indefinitely. I would focus right now on what the team is working on in the short term. There's been some discussion that it's impossible to change your car concept in the middle of the season, and that fundamentally it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And why do it? You're going to be set further back if you try this. I mean, they're already going backwards anyway. There's no reason to stop to use that as a justification to stop going in a new direct or to stop what you're doing and going in a new direction. But also, when we saw several teams last season fundamentally change their car concept mid-season. Aston Martin did by just directly cloning a Red Bull more than anything else I've ever seen. But then Williams did and McLaren did to a degree as well. But to be honest, even though Aston Martin started with a Red Bull-esque concept, look at where their car is now. I know Christian Horner may have made some cheeky comments, and even Checo Perez recently about Aston Martin being a Red Bull clone. But if you look at the technical details of it, it's not. There are fundamental differences to that car than the way that Red Bull operates their car, and of course, it has different suspension and different engine and everything else as well. So I think that's just a bit of gamesmanship, bit of team principle stuff with what Mr. Horner was saying. But the point is that even though Aston Martin started off this process with a very Red Bull looking car, their Barcelona spec AMR 22, where they've ended up now is actually quite different. And the sooner you get that process started, the more time you have to explore that design space and come up with something that really is genuinely your own. And to be clear, if Aston Martin can get to where they've gotten with that disappointed design space, imagine what Mercedes could do. Right? Yes. I mean, the biggest upside is Mercedes has been kind of competing with Ferrari and Red Bull with the concept that is now admitted to be holding them back. Imagine how good they could do with a different one. I mean, I think that there's a lot more performance on the table that they can actually get access to.
The ceiling is way high, Bryson. Here's hoping. But as we round third base, I don't want to bury the lead with Aston Martin. I'm going to ask you some questions from my subscribers, Elite Peddlers, if I may, in the last 10 minutes. Maria says, and you've just touched on it there, Bryson, here's why I ask you the question. I would like to know Bryson's thoughts on what could account for the big performance difference between the Mercedes and the Aston Martin Cognizant, given the fact that they share so many components, including the engine, gearbox, rear suspension, etc., and yet Aston Martin looks like they are much faster than Merc on track. To that you respond, how, sir?
So I think at this point in the maturity of the regulations, pretty much all cars are on the weight limit, or maybe slightly below. So I don't think it's a weight question. I think it's pretty clear it's aero. It's all aero. It's peak downforce level. I think the Mercedes still has a little bit less drag than the Aston Martin does. Aston Martin was still not really blowing up the speed traps, but it's downforce level. They don't have enough downforce, and as I said before, that doesn't only impact your ultimate pace, your one lap pace, but it's a huge factor in your tire degradation. Huge factor. So not only are you losing time in these high speed corners, but you're wearing through your tires more as well. Now, to be clear, there are infinite number of details into why the car has more downforce, and we can explore hypotheses about this, qualified hypotheses, because again, I don't have access to their CFD. But their side pod design is really very interesting because if you remember, the launch version of the Williams had a side pod design that was, I can only describe as vanishing. Right, it had an inlet and it just disappeared into the abyss, and it was totally sort of unconstrained flow behind it. Not as extreme as W13 was, but it came out wide and then went towards the center of the chassis again. If you look at the Aston Martin, it actually has just as aggressive a down slope on the back end of that valley in the side pod as Williams did, but they retain this higher side pod, this higher wall towards the outside bit. And the reason why I think that's beneficial is precisely as I said before. These cars, you can't get the front tire wake far enough away from the car to be totally unattached all the time. It's going to have to attach to something on the side pod. You want to direct it towards the tire instead of getting it towards the Coke bottle and stuff. I feel like they've taken the best of a couple of designs. We talk about Ferrari and it has kind of a value there. I do think about that, but maybe even Williams as well. It's almost like they get that aggressive motion, the aggressive geometry of the top of the side pod to draw clean airflow from the top and get it directly to the beam wing and the diffuser. But they also have enough of a sidewall to keep that front tire wake outboard and prevent it from going into places where it shouldn't. So I think that the short answer to her question is it's aero. Aston Martin has much better aerodynamics than Mercedes does at the moment. And as far as how they're doing that, the side pod is definitely a big part of it. I think that's just a fundamental part. I know Mercedes talks about it not being the core of their problems, but it seems to be too central of a device to not think about it. And the one wild card we don't know is the floors. We had some cars stopping on track, during testing. Well, and even Aston Martin stopped and Mercedes stopped, but they were very careful about how they were either rolled off or lifted up onto the flatbed truck. Mercedes zipped their car in a cloth bag.
Yeah,
it had a Mercedes brand on it. I really love that attention to detail. But we haven't seen the floors yet, and I imagine we're just hoping, waiting during one of these races for a car to have an issue and be picked up by marshals who are not interested in protecting your secrecy. They want to get the car off the track as quickly as possible, and the photographers are going to be there taking all kinds of snapshots. And so, I think given this ground effect era of cars, the floor is the most important part of the car design, and the problem is that's the one thing we haven't seen from all the cars. So hopefully we'll get some insight into that eventually.
Let's go, Bryson. Neo asks Aston Martin, there is a question about a simple, straight to the point floor, and that with a bit of development, do you think that other teams could get much closer to them with doing something similar? So sorry, straight to the point floor, do you think that could facilitate Aston Martin and the likes of Ferrari bridging some of that negative delta towards Red Bull and their RB19?
To answer that, I have to know more what they mean by straight to the point floor.
I
Like
think I think they're just saying simple, no frills, right?
no frills. Yeah, I mean there's definitely a way for engineers to sometimes be too clever for their own good. It's like we think that we have a good understanding of what's happening, but as I said before, it either doesn't do what's expected or there's some sort of nonlinearity that deviates from the model. I can understand that. I just don't know enough about their floor design, about the concept of it, the philosophy of it, what type of flow structures they're trying to produce, how they contour the roof of the tunnels, how they work with the side with the keel underneath the center of the car as well. There are so many structures underneath there that we just don't have insight into. I can't make any informed comment as to what people are going to do, but I do know as soon as the car becomes uh, picked up for any reason, and we get pictures of it, we'll know a lot more about what they're doing. But
We
no, I mean you have to give Aston Martin credit for the work that
oh
they're
mate,
doing because it would be what they're doing is something that hasn't been done in
oh 09
12 years, 15 years, something like that.
Braun.
And even Braun might actually be the closest comparison because Braun was born of an aborted Honda project, right? It ultimately came from a chassis design from Honda, but a power unit or an engine at that time from Mercedes, and that's kind of what we're seeing. I mean, they do have an incredible thing. The one thing that Aston Martin is praying, hoping is not like Braun is that they don't follow the same drop off in lack of development that Braun had in 2009. Braun was incredible in imperious form through the first half of the season, but because they couldn't develop their car to compete with the rest of the grid, they barely won those championships. So Aston Martin, I'm not saying that they're competing for a championship right now, but given the fact that they've utterly destroyed the midfield, we thought Aston Martin was competing with the likes of Alpine and McLaren. They're way
Gone.
beyond that. I mean, we're asking questions about Aston Martin. Really, we should be asking questions about what is Alpine and McLaren not doing as much as what Aston Martin is
Absolutely,
doing.
mate.
But they've blasted completely past that and are threatening the top three. So they're doing something that hasn't been done in many years. And I think that with Fernando, like him or hate him, Fernando's a good driver, and
Just a bit, mate.
he's in a position where he can actually fight for wins. I think even his experience is going to be helpful for Lewis Hamilton also, because fighting him on a regular basis is always going to get the juices flowing. But it also proves that age is not a factor in modern Formula One the way it used to
True,
be.
true.
I know he made that joke of 60s being the new 40s and et cetera, et cetera. I heard that radio message for Nando. But honestly, I mean, the vast improvements in safety technology and barrier technology and the way we conduct the races now, virtual safety cars and all those kind of things, they make it possible to have a long career. And so all this Lewis Hamilton retiring talk, they just need to, just miss me with that. You know?
Miss me with it, Bryson says. Let's go. Go on then. Finally, I'm going to pair up two questions. Mary asks if you think it's a bit sus, the leaps and bounds that Aston Martin have come over the course of one season. And to pair with that, you've kind of touched on it already. Gareth alludes to the fact that, I mean, is it valid to make a comparison between Braun as far as their silver bullets being the blown double diffuser or whatever it was called? Do you think Aston Martin are leveraging a similar silver bullet?
Yeah, I mean, in reverse order, we live in the legacy of what's happened in the past. And so I think when they were coming up with the technical regulations for this current generation of cars, they were wary of what Braun did. And they tried their best to constrain the regulations in a way that doesn't give you such a big loophole in performance. And if there is one, it can't produce a lot of outwash and make the cars harder to race each other. I suspect that Aston Martin doesn't have a single definitive thing that they've done, like a double diffuser, that's giving so much performance. As I said before, I think the performance is written in all the many details of the car design, precise angles of contours, geometry, everything working at the highest level. Again, imperceptible differences that you can't really see have a huge impact on performance, especially in aero. And the benefit that Aston Martin has is in aero. Regarding, do I find it suspect that they've made such a big jump, especially given the historical context? All I'll say is that car better be legal. Okay, it better be legal because this story is so good, and they're doing such a great job. The job that they're doing is so good that it's proving It's proving that it's possible to bridge the gap to the top three. It would be so unfortunate if something comes to light that is uh not up to snuff, so to speak. So I hope they haven't done anything strange. I can tell you that every other team on the grid is checking, and they are motivated to find out if there's something illegal going on with that car. But no, in general, I don't have any reason to suspect anything is going wrong there. Apart from they just did a great job. They've recruited great people. They've used their allocations, win total time, safety time, very accurately. I remember once saying that Lawrence Stroll had, super villain esque aspirations, building a James Bond like golden eye style compound, and he is, and he has the plans to do that. That's not saying he's a bad guy or anything. That's not like that. I'm just saying the scale of his ambition seems to be pretty grand, and they seem to be delivering. So even if this year turns out to fizzle a bit in the second half, where other teams sort of catch up to Aston Martin, or they fall back a little bit, it's sort of a proof of concept that it can't be done. And I think it really bodes well for the future for them.
And you know what, Bryson? It wouldn't be atypical, unlike F1, to go and create another controversial storyline, right? Crashgate, Spygate, Fuelgate, what's the next gate? Aston Martin Cognizant Gate, maybe. But Bryson, talk to me about what you've got going on currently. Tech Heads F1 podcast is doing crazy numbers. Go and check that out on all podcasting platforms, iTunes, Spotify, if you have it, and make sure to leave a rating, because Bryson, Dr. Obbs and Molly are doing god tier levels of F1 podcasting work. Bryson, tell me that you got plans to be on that YouTube channel doing those Tech Bites segments imminently.
Yeah, I'm actually. I think I'm going to do one on gurney flaps. Actually, there's been a lot of discussion about that, and why they're such a great aerodynamic device. If you listen to episode 14 of the podcast, I do gush a little bit about how cool those devices are. They're incredibly simple but very powerful. So I'll probably be doing that. No, we're definitely we have the podcast has been going well. As I said before, there is a bit of a conflict there, right? Because the purpose of the podcast has always been documentary conversations, give me an excuse to interview people I have no right talking to, that kind of a thing. But it is growing. It is growing. We do have a presence now on Instagram as well, Tech Heads F1, as well as YouTube. And so I think we'll gauge how to progress it moving forward. But it's been a great opportunity to meet some new people and to talk some of the techie things. And like I said, I think we're only in the second year of this development cycle for the current regulations. It's going to be a development war to a degree. Yes, teams are starting, in a slightly different situation than they were before, but there is a ton of potential left in these regulations to find lap time. Red Bull's proving it. Red Bull gains so much time, year on year. I think that there are going to be a lot of very interesting technical developments that are going to happen over the course of the season. I'm definitely looking forward to analyzing those and talking to people who work with this directly. But it's been fun. I hope I get to do it more. And if something else comes up, I'll do that too.
Bryson, I just want to take the time out to say thank you again for blessing the F1 hour. The keynote months, you would have seen that I had a cheeky microphone issue there, muted when I shouldn't have, completely noddy. But if you enjoyed the conversation with Bryson, do yourselves a favor and go and follow him at Natural Paradigm on Twitter. Go and check out the podcast Tech Heads F1 podcast on all good podcasting platforms. Tech Bite segments with Dr. Obbs currently on YouTube. Bryson will be doing them soon as well. And if you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, do me a favor kindly and leave me a 5-star rating. And if you haven't subscribed already, then of course it's a cheeky switchback that you need to pull on the subscribe. Between now and next time, as always, remember to look but never stare. Peace.